In this lecture, I want to continue on what we talked about in our previous lecture. We want to finish the implementation of our own content provider. We want to create a client that uses that content provider. So if you remember from the last lecture, we created our own content provider. It contained a database. We wrote our SQLite Open Helper class for all our database operations. We created our own contracts class that we utilize in our content provider. We're also going to utilize that in our client. And then in our content provider, we implemented the CRUD operations as well as the get type and the onCreate method. So now we want to create a new Android Studio project. Actually, we don't want to create a new one. We're going to reuse our database application from the previous section, and we're going to remove the database part of it, and we're going to use a content provider instead. So let's close this project that came up as the last project, and let's open our database example project. And so if you remember this used to work where we had our layouts, our add employee, modify employee, view record, and our fragment. And then we had some database helpers. Well, first of all, we don't want to communicate with the database anymore. So we can go ahead and delete the database helper class because we're going to use a content provider. So we're going to delete database helper. We're going to say delete anyway. And we don't need the loader class because we don't need to subclass our cursor loader. We can use a cursor loader class now that we're going to use a content provider. So we can delete my loader. And so all we need are these three classes. Before we can start utilizing our content provider, we need to add a dependency and link to that. So we can go to File, we can say New, and we can say Import Module, and we want to import our contracts class. So that was in our my provider contract and our app module. So we can say OK. We can rename this to my provider contract. And then we can add a dependency to it as well so that we can now utilize the contract for accessing the static variables. So we're going to do our sync. We're then going to go to our database example, and we're going to go to our project structure. And inside our project structure, our dependencies, we're going to add dependencies for that module. We're going to add a module dependency for my provider contract for the app. And we could have linked to the library, but just in case we need to edit it, we're going to include it in here. So now that we have our provider contract, we can resync, and we can start modifying our activities to no longer use the database helper, but to use our content resolver, the content resolver object in the content provider. So let's start modifying our activities. And let's look at the main activity first. So anywhere we see database stuff, we can remove. So we can remove the database. We don't have access to the static database, so we're going to have to put our column names in. We can't use our static variables anymore. So for our column names, we have to hard code them. So we're just going to replace the from clause with hard-coded strings that we know the columns for. We could go the same route, the contract for the content provider, make a contract for the database. So we know the columns that we need are ID, name, and address. So we're going to keep that the same. We still need our loader. We just don't need to subclass the loader. Everything else is good so far. We don't need the helper anymore. We're using content resolver. We still need to provide everything here. And we still need to have our set item click listener. And our onResume, that gets invoked. I went back and modified this because I didn't like the fact that we were starting activities in our other activities. So instead, in the onResume, I call the restart loader method. If you remember from the last time we demoed the database, in our modify employee, in our add employee, we were creating an intent and then calling start activity, which recalled the onCreate. It's not really the best way to do it. Instead, you should call the finish method, and then in the onResume in the main activity, just restart the loader. And that's how I implemented it. We have our menu stuff. We still need our onCreate loader, but we don't need to subclass anymore because we have a content provider. So in the onCreate loader, we can create a new cursor loader and this is how you normally do it. We can say new cursor loader. We can say this for the application, and now we want to use our contract. So we can say my provider contract, and we want to pass it the content URI, and we also want to pass in the table names. So we can say new string here, and then we want to use null for our projection or our selection and selection args, and we just want to sort the name in ascending. So for the sort order, we can say sort ascending. So when we create a loader, we're going to return a new cursor loader. Got to make sure we import this. We want to make sure we do the version 4. And so what this is going to do is it's going to call the query method for the loader, because we're saying my content URI, new string, and the cursor loader only calls the query method. We don't have to explicitly call the query. For the insert and the update and the delete, we'll have to call the update, insert, and delete. But because the cursor loader is only going to handle a query, you can just pass in the content URI with the tables. It's going to select all of the employees. In the add load finished, we can keep it as data and null. And so we're done with the main activity. We're going to be able to return all of our records. And it's a pretty easy implementation. We just use our content provider and our content URI to call the query method, and we assign it a new cursor loader. We still have to implement our other activities, our add employee activity. So we can go through here. We can get rid of our database stuff. We still need our text fields. We don't want to call myhelper.add anymore. What we want to do now is we want to call the insert method on our content resolver. And we have to populate our content value. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a content values object and then put in the content values, the name and the address of the edit text fields. We then need to call the getContentResolver method and call insert on it. So we can say getContentResolver.insert. We want to pass it the content URI and the values. Very simple. Insert's pretty easy. For the update and the modifier, we're going to need to pass in an ID. So then we're done with insert. We're using the content resolver and the content provider that we created. So now we have to go to modify and update. We can first remove all of our database stuff since we're using our own content provider. Don't need to do any of this. We don't need to call update, and we don't need to call myhelper. And we noticed the return to main activity has changed. It's going to call finish. It's not going to create a new intent. And so for our modify employee, we're going to need to populate the content values object for our update, which we'll implement first. And we're just going to populate that with our edit text values, whatever we changed. And here we have to add the ID to the path. We're going to use a different path for our content provider. So we're going to create a URI named employee, and we're going to say parse the content URI plus a / plus the ID. The ID, remember, is inside it's a member variable that we get when we pass it into this activity, because we need to know what we're updating or deleting. So we're just going to use the other path for our content provider, passing in the ID. Then we can just call our update method on the content provider. We can get the content provider by saying getContentResolver.update employee, which is our URI, with our ID passed in, our content values, and we're not going to have any where selection args. And then we're going to return to the main activity. We can also, for delete, we also have to add the ID to our content URI. So we're going to create a local variable here, URI employee, and we're going to pass in the ID that was passed into this activity. We're then going to just call delete on our content provider, passing in our employee, passing in no where selection args. We could pass in where selection args for delete or for update since it supports it, but we're not going to. And that's it. We're now going to use our content provider. So we want to bring up the emulator first, and we want to make sure that our content provider was installed. Before we do that, I want to mention that we don't need to modify the manifest file at all, because our content provider doesn't need any permissions. So we don't need to access any permissions. If we bring up our emulator, and what we want to do is we just want to make sure our content provider has been installed. So we want to look at our applications in settings and see that our content provider is there. So we can go to apps and notifications, and we go to app info, and we just want to look for, I think it was called my content provider. And it's there, my content provider. If I select it, it's installed. It doesn't have any permissions associated with it. So now we can try to install our client. We can say build and run. Built successfully. Now we can run it. And when we run it, we should see the application come up, and it should come up with whatever was in the database. And I believe there might be a few records in the database from previously. We might have cleared out the database. So now let's try adding some records. Because this is a new, actually there would be no records in it because it's in the content provider, and the content provider created a new database in its local storage, its internal storage. So we have to add some records first. We can say Jason Fedden, 23 Main Street, Rochester, New York, 14617. And we say add, this should add it to the content provider, and then this reads from the content provider. So it looks good. Let's add another one. And let's just say Main Street. So we're reading, we're first inserting into the content provider, and then we're reading the content provider using a loader. So our insert and our read works. Now let's see if we can click this and we can edit it. Let's say Jason Fedden 33. We can say update, and it updated. Let's we don't want to add. Well, we'll add another one. And now let's test that our delete works. We can select Mike Smith, and we can say delete, and it's no longer in the database. So you should notice that when we wrapped our database in a content provider, the client code became a lot simpler. We don't need to have a database helper. We don't need to do anything regarding the cursor loader. We don't need to subclass the cursor loader. We can just, in our initialization of our loader, we can easily just return a new cursor loader object passing in the content URI. So our database application became a lot easier. This is our client. This is how we used the content provider that we created. Thank you.